So we have a real treat today because the father of the groom, Doron Krakow, Doron and Janet, parents of Yoni, they were here for the ufruf of their children, but I had the pleasure of sitting with you and Janet in Jerusalem. You've made Aliyah a few months ago, and you have a very, so you're here because you're the father of the groom, but you're here right now because you have an incredibly powerful, personal, emotional, lifelong Israel story. So Doron, I just want to jump into our content right away. Tell us your October 7th story.
My wife Janet and I were blessed to become first-time grandparents in August, actually on the 23rd of August, when our son Aaron and daughter-in-law Zoe, who live in Jerusalem, welcomed a baby boy named David for my father. We had gone to Israel in the middle of August to be there for the birth and the Brit Milah, and decided to stay to lend a hand to the kids, neither of whom had the kind of support close family nearby. So we thought we would stay through the holidays, and Janet and I flew back to the States on the afternoon of October 6th. After a short dinner and a quick end of the day, I was up at about 2 o'clock in the morning with jet lag, and the terrible attack on Israel was underway. The kids in Jerusalem were under rocket fire, and they had already fled their apartment because their building didn't have a bomb shelter, and to be with friends of ours in a suburb of Jerusalem called Motza. Within a couple of hours, Aaron had received his orders that he was to return to his unit. He's a combat infantryman and a medic in the paratroopers. And by that evening, he was back in uniform. The next morning, his unit was deployed to Kfar Aza, where they were still trying to drive out terrorists that had not yet been driven from the kibbutz. And it was clear that we would be without Aaron for a little while, and Zoe and the baby would be on their own. The baby was 6 weeks old.
So can we pause right here for a second? So David, your grandson, is born in August, and Aaron, your son, now has a 3-month-old, or whatever the math is, a baby, little infant child, and he's told that he needs to be called away from domestic bliss and harmony and the joy of raising a 3-month-old baby, and not only go to service, but to go actually to fight the terrorists who perpetrated October 7th, which was a very bloody business. A lot of Israeli soldiers died to get the terrorists out of Israel. I mean, not to be a cliche, but how did that make you feel when your son was leaving home to go fight terrorists?
Look, the sense of the entire story was heart-wrenching and incredibly stressful, very familiar to every Israeli family, I think, to so many of us that are close to friends and family there. I couldn't imagine what it must have been like for Aaron to leave his wife and son. I'll remind everybody that in those first days, the rocket fire was almost continuous. It was all over the center of the country. There were dozens of attacks in the Jerusalem area, obviously Tel Aviv. So when I spoke to Aaron before he left for his deployment, I told him that for as long as he needed to be away from his family, he should focus on the job that was in front of him, and that I would come and be with Zoe and the baby until he came home. So at noon on Sunday, I was back on a plane heading back to Israel, and went and collected Zoe and the baby and the dog at our friends in Motza, and we began a 4-month life together, trying very hard to be a supportive grandfather to a new mother and a newborn at a time where they were fearful that my son, in the worst possible situation, his fate and destiny were unknown. And Aaron finally came home at the end of January after several months of combat in Gaza. So I was there. Janet, my wife, spelled me on 2 occasions when I had to be back in the States for work-related responsibilities. I was busy with that along the way as well, but we managed to make sure that Zoe and the baby wouldn't be alone until till they got their husband and father home.
Well, and Doron, could you just double click on the emotions of that experience, how it felt? So first of all, so you and Janet were away for the most part. Janet's taking care of aging parents in New York and Jersey. You're taking care of David, your 3-month-old grandchild, and helping Zoe, your daughter-in-law, while Aaron is in Gaza. And you're doing this for 4 months, and you have anxiety and uncertainty. What will be with your son? What was it like emotionally to wake up in the morning on October 9th, on October 10th, on October 11th, on October 12th, on October 13th, day after day, with that fog of uncertainty and worry? How did you make it through those days?
Every day was a reminder that we were all living in a nightmare. You wake up in the morning, you have 2 seconds of it's a new day, and then you remember where you are and what you're doing. To be part of a new grandson's life every single day was an incredible blessing, and it was a great light. And at the same time, I watched Zoe struggle, not sleeping. The baby wasn't sleeping so well. She was having trouble breastfeeding and all the stresses and strains that one could imagine. And to be honest, I was feeling like an underperformer in every aspect of my life, not being a good enough father and grandfather, not being good enough help to Zoe, not being good enough at my job, not being a particularly successful husband, being months away from my wife and my kids who were here. And yet, there was nothing at all out of the ordinary about what I was seeing and experiencing. It was happening in almost every home, every apartment in the country, where either they were suffering a horrific loss of somebody from October 7th, or they were among those that had been taken and whose whereabouts were unknown, or their sons or daughters or husbands, wives were in uniform, in combat someplace, or hiding out somewhere from an inbound rocket attack, which became incredibly routine until you remind yourself that every single time the alarm goes off, somebody's trying to kill you and the people that you love.
So, Doron, I'm so appreciative of your voice here because, let me just, to zoom the story, roll it forward. You and Janet made Aliyah. Could you tell us when and why you chose just now to make Aliyah?
Yeah, first of all, our Aliyah date was June 26th, so we're just on the back end of that. As it happens, 6 years to the day that our son Aaron completed his Aliyah, purely coincidental. We had decided in the midst of the fighting, in the midst of the war, that the moment in our lives had come where we needed to hitch our wagon to Israel and Israelis who were on the front line of securing the future, the present and the future of the Jewish people, and that if there was a place we needed to be, that was it. We didn't know in what context, we didn't know what the circumstances were going to be, but we knew that, and it wasn't until I came back, assuming that I would pick up my life and work here, which was, a significant pursuit, that I realized that we needed to be closer to our kids there, who were going to be dealing with the greater stresses and strains, that our job was to be whatever they needed us to be, for however long they needed us to be that. And so while I'm certain our lives will continue to be divided, we still have lots of wonderful family and remarkable blessings in the offing here, that we'll spend a substantial, if not the disproportionate amount of our time there now, just is the right place for us.
So, Doron, I want to just pause on this for a second. You and Janet make Aliyah on June 26th. Today is August 10th. Could you reflect in real time on the difference in meaning making, what meaning you make out of living in America as an American Jew, and what meaning you make living in Israel as an Oleh?
It's a very interesting question. I've had the great good fortune to spend my professional life as a servant of the Jewish community here. I've had multiple chapters running the Young Judea Youth Movement and leading the Israel and overseas effort for the Federation System, and as the senior representative of Ben Gurion University of the Negev for a number of years, most recently as the head of the JCC Association. And it seemed to me that the mission was always the same. It was a commitment to strengthening Jewish peoplehood. It was a commitment to ensuring that growing numbers of American Jews would understand that whether we choose to make our lives here or there, what happens in Israel has a profound impact on the future of our families and our communities, and so to be part of efforts to build and strengthen those ties was a powerful motivator for me. And while I think there was always a part of me that wanted to be in Israel, there was critically important work to be done here, and I was enormously proud of being in a position to try to do some good, sometimes more successfully, sometimes less successfully, as you would imagine, but it was always very meaningful. And to be honest, as we settle into Aliyah and as I circle in on what my next professional role is going to be there, and I'm not yet sure what it's going to be, I don't know that it will have the grand landscape that I had the privilege of working on here, but I believe I've come to a point in my life where the smaller landscape and having a chance to touch and impact lives in a far more intimate way is exactly where I'm supposed to be.
So, Don, I want to, that answer is so rich, because underneath it is kind of the difference between Israeli Jews, how they feel about Israel, and American Jews. I want to talk about that, and which is, when you're in Israel, you just really sympathize with, identify with, support what Israelis are going through, which is unimaginable. And then you come back to North America, and there's a lot of ifs, ands, and buts, and there's a lot of ambivalence, and there's a lot of the other side, and suffering of Gaza civilians, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Could you talk about those different, and you were literally living, your son's on the front lines, your 3-month-old grandson, his father's off for war, et cetera. You've uprooted your life. And then you come back and talk about what you found with North American Jews that you were dealing with at the JCC, and what happened when those two viewpoints were very different from one another.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that my view of these things has become increasingly refined in these months, never by design, but just as a result of experience. Israelis are an ornery and irascible society. It's a can-do kind of a place, but it was suffering just as significant divisions societally as we seem to be suffering from here in the year leading up to October 7th. And when its existence was placed at risk, the country came together in ways that I will be forever inspired by. And we saw a TikTok generation in Israel that I believe is Israel's greatest generation, a degree to which they poured themselves into every effort of service and support and volunteerism, leaves me remarkably optimistic about the future. The challenges that we have faced here is that we've had it so good for so long that we're trying to view being good Americans through the lenses of some Jewish ideas, but we're in many cases far less rooted. That was part of the mission of coming to work in the JCC movement, was to see whether the JCCs could be harnessed to greater Jewish intentionality, greater outcomes. It's still the one place where there's a large and diverse audience. But I think that what's become clearer to me is that when we think of the great wisdom of Hillel, who's known from Pirkei Avot for his 3-part perspective, if I am not for myself, who will be for me? If I am only for myself, what am I? And if not now, when? I think Israelis have long understood that the first part was the defining part. First of all, we have to be for ourselves, because if not, who else is going to be? And I think for many in the American Jewish community, we've gotten far more comfortable with the second part. If I am only for myself, what am I? And so we are remarkably cause-oriented. We are remarkably committed to others who find themselves on the wrong end of discrimination, racism. We see ourselves in supporting them as fulfilling our Jewish identities through a tikkun olam lens. But Hillel put Imena Nili Mili first on purpose, because if you don't understand who you are, and if you are not fundamentally committed to yourself, your service to anybody else is of far more limited significance. And so I think the friction between what I'm seeing in Israel and what we need to see here is a further embrace of Imena Nili Mili. And we've found that our comfort and calm here in American Jewish life is not quite as comfortable and calm as we believed that it was. And we need now to prepare ourselves to be whatever it's going to require us to be in order to endure and overcome it. I think that is the challenge that lies before us here.
So, Doron, as we wrap up, I wanted to ask your wisdom about this season that we're in. Tisha B'Av is Monday night and Tuesday, and my launching pad for that is two recent Danny Gordis pieces, which he's been writing. He's kind of the prophet Jeremiah of this war, and he's been writing copiously ever since. But these two pieces just really hit me in the gut. The first one he wrote after Shiva Asar B'Tammuz. So 17th of Tammuz is when this dark season of 3 weeks begins, and it never meant anything to me. It never meant anything to most American Jews. It was the breach in the wall. It was the 3 weeks. It begins with the breach in the wall, and I just never got that. What does that matter? Who cares? Breach, wall, what? Never mattered. And then Danny Gordis wrote this piece about it, where, as I say, it just hit me in the gut. He said, the Shiva Asar B'Tammuz is about, is this the beginning of the end? Is this the beginning of the end? That is to say, is the Israel that we always knew and loved and believed in, is it the beginning of the end of that Israel? And he quotes narratives and stories from real Israelis, from the north who have been displaced, from the south who have been displaced. And he says to Israelis in the north, when this is over, are you going to go back up north? And they said, what? Are you crazy? Why would we go up north? Hezbollah is right on the other side. We're not going to go back up north. And then he asks Israelis in the south, when this is over, are you going to go back down to Sderot? And they say, what? Are you crazy? Either, for sure, we'll have nightmares every night that they're coming. And the best scenario is we just have nightmares that they're coming. And the worst scenario is that it happens again. We're not going down south. We're not going up north. And he writes in this piece, is this the beginning of the end? And he doesn't resolve it. He leaves it. That's what to mourn for. And I guess I wanted to ask you for your reaction.
Well, a couple of quick things. Danny is brilliant, and he's been a great teacher and a great teacher of mine for many years. He and I actually met for lunch in exactly the same place that you and Janet and I met at the cafe, at the Grand Cafe.
Not that this is the point, but what did you order? I love their lasagna, but I digress.
But I have found Danny to come off as a little bit more fatalistic in recent months than he has in the past. And I don't share his fatalism at all. To react briefly to what you said, something like 70% of the people who were living in the Gaza envelope in those communities that were so devastated have returned or are in the process of returning, in spite of the fact that they and their communities are incredibly traumatized. It is not yet possible to return to the north because Israel has not neutralized the threat to those communities, and the physical infrastructure of those communities are being decimated by the daily rocket fire. Most of those towns and kibbutzim have been largely destroyed, and they're going to need to be rebuilt. But for Israel and for Israelis, this is far from the first chapter of this kind. This is far from the first time that they have absorbed through terror and through war, destruction and devastation that would leave the more faint of heart unable or unwilling to imagine themselves going back. I have every expectation that while not everybody who was there and who witnessed and experienced the horrors of October 7th will return to those places, countless other Israelis are going to be determined to go, and it will be competitive to see who gets a lot in those communities as they begin to renew and rebuild. It is sometimes altogether too easy to be in a moment that is as dark and devastating as this one has been, to imagine that there can be light that follows, but there is always light that follows. And for this remarkably resilient nation, I have no doubt that that light will come. And if you'll permit me one last thought, many of you, I assume, here today know Israel well and have spent significant time there. It never fails to impress me with the fact that it's a very small country. There are no people in Israel who have not been traumatized by this experience. You're talking about the victims themselves. You're talking about the families of the victims, the families of hostages, 115 of whom are still in the hands of butchers somewhere in the dungeons of Gaza, still to be recovered. You're talking about the soldiers, the hundreds who have been killed in combat, and the thousands who have been severely wounded, which we don't read about, those that are missing limbs or lost eyesight, who have suffered traumatic brain injuries. You're talking about the families of all those who are still in uniform. You're talking about first responders. You're talking about civil guardsmen. There just isn't a place where if you peel back a corner, you don't find somebody who is in terrible trauma, which is heartbreaking and at the same time remarkably unifying, because everybody knows that everybody else is largely in a similar place, and that will pull us together. It will be a generation before Israelis recover from what we're living through. But we read in the Passover Haggadah that in every generation there are those who rise up to destroy us. And so each of us bear responsibility in our time, in our generation, to do what's necessary to enable us to rise and see a better day. And what more significant reminder can we have than the upcoming wedding of a beautiful couple from two wonderful families and a blessed community. So again, I'm very, very proud and honored to be part of this service today.
Doron, as Isaiah says next week, Nachamu, Nachamu, Ami, and may your words of optimism and hope and consolation be fulfilled. And Mazel Tov on the upcoming wedding. Thank you, Doron. Thank you.